Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's afternoon session. As you are aware, the South African Bar Association hosts a program every Thursdays from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. This program is intended to deal with a legal topic, advocacy-related topic intended to improve the skill set of practitioners and thereby to improve the quality of legal presentation in our courts. Participants are encouraged to ensure that their video cameras and microphones are deactivated during the presentation and to unmute themselves only during the question and answer session. Following the presentations, questions raised during the question and answer session must please be restricted to the topic under discussion. I now go to a brief CV of our esteemed guest. Our esteemed guest for today is Attorney Aslam Moolla. Attorney Aslam Moolla is the founding partner of Moolla Attorneys Incorporated, a law firm that operates throughout South Africa and with international clients. The firm has a particular focus into South African labor law and its practical application and implementations from a macro to individual perspective. Aslam himself holds a master's in law from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He is a practicing attorney, a member of several organizations, and has over a decade of legal experience. Aslam today shall be addressing us on a topic titled Latest Developments Around COVID-19 Mandatory Vaccinations. As you are all aware, this session is recorded and will be made available upon the South African Bar Association website, that being www.rsabar.net. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you, Aslam. Over to you, Aslam.
Hello, Ahmed. Thank you for introducing me, and it's my pleasure to be here as well. Can everyone hear me?
Thank you, Aslam. Thank you for that. We can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Okay, I'm now going to be sharing my PowerPoint presentation. Please tell me if you can see it.
I am able to see it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So let's get started with it. I've got a very short presentation today, but essentially covering the policy and legal landscape when it comes to mandatory vaccinations in South Africa. As the host has indicated, I do specialize in labor law, and one of the aspects that we're going to be covering today is, should the government make mandatory vaccinations compulsory in the workplace? And more importantly, can an employee be fired for not being vaccinated? Later on, we're going to be looking at some of the recent updates to South African law in respect of that. However, why don't we start off by looking at the international landscape first, in particular, having a look at international policy. The first aspect to look at is the British government, which has come forward and instructed companies to make vaccines compulsory. Also, other countries such as Italy, France, and Greece have introduced mandatory vaccinations for health workers and certain government workers as well. We also look at the United States, where President Joe Biden has announced a plan that will require businesses which employ more than 100 employees to ensure that their staff are fully vaccinated or show a negative COVID test result once a week before coming to work. But what about South Africa? What is the policy in South Africa? Currently, the South African government says that it will not make COVID vaccinations compulsory. You all remember the speech from the president where he indicated that. However, the government has come forward and indicated that they will not stop companies from introducing mandatory vaccinations. What this means is that companies have a right to introduce a mandatory vaccination in the workplace if they feel that it's going to be of beneficial interest to their employees and it's going to create a safe working environment. That covers a brief overview of the international landscape and where South Africa sits from a policy perspective. Now, how does a person prove that they are vaccinated? Obviously, it's through a vaccine certificate, which is made available to confirm a person's vaccination status. This is important to ensure that there is what we call herd level immunity amongst the population. That's what most governments are striving for at this point in time. My question to the audience today is, are vaccines the only way to ensure immunity? Natural immunization occurs when a person recovers from the illness. In other words, when someone's being infected with COVID and they've recovered either through a form of treatment, whether that's being hospitalized or being treated at home, and now they've developed a kind of resistance to COVID naturally. Will that not also count as a level of immunization? These are questions for us to consider. More questions and more important and burning questions are, for instance, the testing of vaccines. That seems to be the #1 issue at this point in time when we get clients and companies saying, should we make it mandatory? How do we know whether the vaccine has been fully, independently, and rigorously tested against control groups? And what are the outcome of these tests? Other vaccines like the polio one, been around for decades. The COVID vaccines, we're only talking about a couple of years here. How do we know the long-term impact of these vaccines? Also, what about the ingredients of these vaccines? Are they toxic to the human body? Do they cause adverse reactions in the long term? These are some of the questions that we need to consider. Now, speaking about adverse reactions, people who are taking the vaccines, who have been told to take the vaccines, have they been fully informed of their rights before they've been forced to take the vaccine? For example, some of the vaccines have had adverse reactions. Some have caused blood clotting. What happens in cases like that? Also, are people aware that the vaccine could potentially be a form of experimental mRNA gene altering therapy? In other words, it does change a component of your immune response. And are the masses of people globally aware of that? These are questions for us to consider. From a legal perspective, what happens if an employee experiences any adverse reactions? Will the manufacturer of the vaccine be liable? Or if the manufacturer cannot be held liable, will the employer be held liable? The reason why is because if the employer is introducing a mandatory workplace vaccine policy and something happens to the employee, can the family institute legal action against the manufacturer, or must the family sue the employer because it was upon the employer's request that the vaccine be taken in order to carry out employment? These are some of the burning questions. Let's take a look at what the law says now. There are 3 main grounds which are relied upon for mandatory vaccinations. And the first main ground are the regulations which were issued under the state of disaster declared in March 2020. These were used to regulate South Africa's COVID-19 response. Under these regulations, a person can be forced to undergo COVID-19 testing And if they are infected, they must be isolated. Essentially, then, this is a form of compulsory isolation and quarantine. It does restrict a person's rights immensely. The second basis for introducing mandatory workplace vaccinations are the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which requires employers to provide a working environment that is safe and without a health risk. The third basis that companies rely on is, or rather, the directives which were issued by the Department of Labor. Essentially, these directives support the introduction of mandatory workplace vaccines, especially for employees who are at high risk for contracting COVID-19. The main legal critic and the main defense the introducing mandatory vaccines are people's constitutional rights. Some of these rights include the right to bodily integrity, freedom of religion, and of course, dignity. However, as we are all aware, no right in the Constitution is absolute. In other words, the response to the constitutional rights to bodily integrity, religion, is Section 36 of our Constitution, which states that no right is absolute and can be limited, which means that it cannot be enforced. So where does that leave us? Fortunately, we have some court decisions which we can use to guide us in interpreting the above. Let's look at a High Court decision in Pretoria, which found that the closing of mosques as part of lockdown measures was a justifiable limitation on the right to freedom of religion. The argument was that the measure would assist in controlling the pandemic, and the court specifically recognized the concept of Ubuntu, which meant that calling on citizens to make sacrifices to their individual rights for the greater good of curbing the pandemic. The second major case that we have is that of the Supreme Court of Appeal, which recognized the trade-off between individual liberties and curbing the spread of COVID-19. This was a judgment that found the regulations of the state of disaster to be largely constitutional. The ruling essentially stated that limiting individual liberties, such as the right to freedom of movement and the right to dignity, was justified because it protected the right to life, especially people who were vulnerable to those who were dying from COVID-19. Now, with those judgments in mind, how does this affect labor law? Can we use those judgments to come to a deduction, or do we have other resources available? Fortunately, we do. There is a recent CCMA case by the name of Mulderich versus Gold Rush. And this case confirmed that a person can be dismissed from work for not being vaccinated. The ground that was relied upon was incapacity. The employer's evidence was that the company had taken all procedural steps. They had set up a committee, they had put in place a policy, they had even provided for exemptions to those who were forced to be vaccinated. But the employee in question, the employee that was fired, that employee did not qualify for an exemption. And the employer also went to the CCMA and indicated that it could not accommodate the employee in any other position. And that is the gist of an incapacity dismissal. So in labor law, we have only three types of dismissal. We have a misconduct dismissal, where someone is dismissed from work for doing something wrong. We have a retrenchment, which is a no-fault dismissal, but a dismissal based on the operational requirements of a company for example, financial structure or technological, the company cannot afford to keep that person anymore. And the third is incapacity. Incapacity goes to the person's ability to perform the functions. So essentially, this person was dismissed for incapacity. Now, one of the major factors for incapacity is also whether the employer could reasonably accommodate the employee in another position. And if that was not possible and dismissal was the only option, then dismissal amongst other factors would be seen to be fair. The employee in this case, this CCMA case, argued on her right to bodily integrity and on her personal fears that she had about the safety of the vaccine. The commissioner, after hearing both sides, had made a ruling that the effect of not being vaccinated at work actually made the employee permanently incapacitated. Let me say that again. The commissioner at the CCMA said, the fact that you are not vaccinated makes you permanently incapacitated. And that is an interpretation of the rulings on incapacity. The commissioner went further to state that the fact that the employee refused to be vaccinated meant that she was not willing to be part of a safe working environment, and that she was a high-risk individual as she had communicated and interacted with her colleagues on a daily basis. The commissioner relied on a memo that was written by Judge Roland Sutherland, DJP of Gauteng Division of the High Court, which emphasized that being vaccinated was actually a civic duty and that the interests of the community must trump personal preferences. To listeners and viewers today, I have a few questions for you to consider. If you were a commissioner in this case, would the situation have been different if the applicant in this case had already received COVID-19 and recovered from the virus, and thereby have positive antibodies? Would the situation be different? Would the company's argument of incapacity still hold water? Furthermore, what if the employee was working from home? Would the risk be minimal in that situation? Would she still be incapacitated from work? These are questions that need to be considered. And I think a lot of reliance on this case, especially in the media, where it's been published that if a person is not vaccinated, they can be dismissed. I don't know if that's an accurate statement, because every case is different. And as I've indicated, what if the person's working from home? What if they've got antibodies? What if they cannot take the vaccine because of medical reasons? They have an allergic response to one of the ingredients. Would that still be unfair? Take a look at another CCMA case, and this is a decision in Koch versus in Dhaka Security. In this case, the employee was required to submit a weekly COVID-19 test result. As a client of theirs, SASOG wanted a 100% vaccination rate or be refused access to their site. The employee was suspended from work, which he claimed to be an unfair labor practice. Now, this is an important aspect to highlight because the first case involved an unfair dismissal. This case deals with an unfair labor practice. The difference being an unfair dismissal is where a person is fired from work. An unfair labor practice involves where the person is still working, however, they are treated unfairly. In this case, he was suspended. He wasn't fired yet. Also, what's interesting to note is that the employer had accommodated other employees in the workplace. 2 were required to submit weekly negative tests, and 1 worked in an isolated office. Yet, this particular employee was suspended from work. At the CCMA, the employee argued that it was his religious beliefs as a Christian that had prevented him from taking the vaccine. The commissioner found that the vaccine had shown a demonstrable success, in the words of the commissioner, in limiting serious illness, and that the employee was not able to show evidence to the contrary. That the purpose of the mandatory vaccination was clear: to create a safe working environment. There were also less restrictive measures in place, like face masks and social distancing, etc. And the commissioner also found that the reliance on religion was baseless and without theological support. Further, that the employee was in daily contact with people. Ultimately, the CCMA found that the suspension was fair. In other words, what the employer had done was a fair labor practice. Is there a way forward? Employers are the driving force behind mandatory vaccinations. They seem to be driving the push at the moment towards employees being vaccinated more than the government in South Africa. And if you had to contrast this to international policy, which we covered in the beginning, there appears to be more questions at this point than answers. Main aspect to consider is, what about exemptions? Every policy, mandatory policy, should have a form of exemption. An exemption would allow for certain employees not to be vaccinated. Currently, the exemptions that I've been seeing on my desk are constitutional and medical. Those are the 2 main grounds. What about religious grounds? Also, what about natural immunity? And if there's one thing to take away, I think this is the strongest aspect to consider. If a person who's had COVID already and recovered from the illness, and they've received a natural immunized response in their system, why should that person be forced to take the vaccine also? I'm not pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. I'm just someone who wants people to know their rights and know what options are available to them. I personally believe that companies should create this as an exemption to say that if a person has had COVID within a period of time, and they can come forward with a positive COVID test result and a positive antibody result after they've been healed, to then compel that person to take the vaccine might be unfair towards that particular person. At the moment, I haven't seen any policies that cover natural immunity. However, as it stands right now, to answer your question, you can be fired from work if you are not vaccinated. That's what the law states. And we've got the CCMA decision to confirm that. However, as we are aware, all decisions can be challenged. Ultimately, we might only get our guidance from the highest court in the land, our constitutional court. If there are any questions, feel free to ask them, and I thank you for participating in today's presentation.
Aslam, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. If I may make a request, may you kindly stop sharing your screen for during or before I open up the question and answer session?
Sorry, Ahmed, did you say I must stop sharing my screen?
Yes, so that just before I open up the question and answer session.
Okay, is that fine?
Perfect, perfectly in order. Thank you all. I have now opened up the question and answer session for a brief question and answer. I've now opened up the question and answer session, and participants that have a question may raise their hand. Alternatively, type the question within the chat box. Aslam, once again, thank you so much for a really informative and rather controversial issue that's before us. I'm going to start and initiate the question and answer session. Now, firstly, you've mentioned that I'm gonna go back to the adverse reactions of the vaccine, what you mentioned. And
Yes.
you mentioned of whether people are aware of the mRNA gene manipulation that's currently there pertaining to the vaccines. Now, I'm gonna link that to another submission which you made, and that was that the law as it stands now is that you are allowed in the labor law, you are allowed to be fired from work if you have not taken any mandatory vaccinations. You've made a further submission stating that employees are the driving force behind mandatory vaccinations. Now, Islam, I come to an important factor and something that needs to be addressed. It's been coming more and more out to the public regarding the adverse reactions of the vaccine. And as you said, the final decision shall be made by the highest court, that being the Constitutional Court. However, would you agree with or what is your submission rather, in your expert opinion, that by virtue of or rather, you mentioned that employees are the driving force behind mandatory vaccination. My submission is that it's not just the employers, not employees, not just the employers, it's a government at all. And obviously, we are talking about something, we're putting the right to your dignity, your right to your freedom, whether it be religion, to various religion aspects and various other aspects over and above your employment. And that's something that doesn't sit too well with me. And I understand that the CCM has already made a ruling, but based on the adverse reactions, which none of us are aware of at this point, what is your submission in that regard?
If I could understand the question, Ahmed, what you're saying is that is it fair to place the right to a safe working environment over the adverse reaction risk?
Precisely so. In view of the fact that we talk about your employment, that's your source of income, and
yes,
in violation of a constitutional right.
That's a good question, Ahmed. I believe that we would be guided on the two decisions, one being from the High Court in Pretoria and the Supreme Court of Appeal, which indicated that the rights of the majority trump the rights of the minority. And taken from that particular interpretation, Ahmed, essentially to answer or frame that question from a policy perspective, companies would argue that the right to a safe working environment benefits the majority over the minority which refuse to be vaccinated. And therefore, the minority should then suffer the loss of income, as you point out. It's not my view. I'm just looking at it from the perspective of recent court decisions. That's why I wanted to touch on the High Court decision and the SA decision, which approved the closure of mosques and the banning and selling of alcohol, etc. Now, granted, Ahmed, closing of mosques and the banning of alcohol is two very different things compared to being vaccinated, which is something that's going into your body. And that's something which we don't know what the long-term effects are. So ultimately, I think it's going to be the highest court in the land which will answer this question.
Thank you so much, Islam. I just honestly wish that there's a lot of controversy around it, and I'm looking forward to a case that brings finality, not just to myself, but to the nation as well.
Absolutely, there's a lot of anxiety, and people don't know what's happening. Can they be fired? They're worried about their livelihoods. They work so hard for their career. They're also worried about their bodies. They don't want to put something in that they're not sure of. It's a real sensitive issue right now. So ultimately, we've had two decisions which have gone in favor of mandatory workplace vaccinations. But any constitutional issue, as you know, can only be confirmed by the Constitutional Court. And my fear is if by that stage it only gets to the Constitutional Court, how many people might have lost their jobs? How many people might have been forced to take the vaccine otherwise that they would not have normally taken the vaccine? So that is the other issue to consider.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aslam. Aslam, there's a question from the chat from Eric Kota. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Eric. The question reads as follows, and I'm going to read it to you verbatim. Can I please ask if it would be possible to rely on traditional grounds not to vaccinate? Not religion, not religious, but traditional. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's an interesting question, Eric. And I think we can group traditional. If I understand you correctly, I would be interpreting it in the sense of kind of spiritual, religious traditional. And if your employer has a mandatory workplace vaccination policy and provides for religious grounds as an exemption, then you can put traditional there to say that according to my tradition and my beliefs, I do not want to be vaccinated. Religious grounds, I think, can be interpreted broadly to include traditions. I'm by no means a constitutional court judge, but this is my view on the matter. I hope that answers your question, Eric.
I hope that Eric, if there's a follow-up to that, you may just unmute your mic and or your video. Okay, I think we're satisfied there. There's a question from Craig Nicholson. I'm going to read it verbatim. There is no other reason than fear behind not wanting to be vaccinated. Anxiety by this fear actually could make people mentally ill. So we now fire an employee already sustaining an occupational injury caused by mandatory vaccination. Our mental responses will differ from person to person. I'm not too sure if that's a comment or if that's a question. I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. I know Craig from my LinkedIn page. Thanks for the comment, Craig. And we do discuss quite a bit on these aspects. This touches on what we had discussed earlier, that because there's so much of uncertainty in the workplace and at home, and should I take the vaccine? Should I just comply? I've got my own concerns about it. I don't want to lose my job. These are the issues that people have to make that decision. And, you know, the CCMA case, which has come out now and clearly has said, if you have a workplace policy that says you must be vaccinated and you don't get vaccinated, then there is a risk that you can be fired for that. Although, like I discussed earlier, it's not a blanket rule, and that was the fear that was in place, that it's a blanket rule in that anyone who doesn't get vaccinated will now be dismissed. What about if you work from home 90% of the time? You only go in 1 day a week. Do you really need to be forced vaccinated? You're already working from home. What if you already had COVID and had positive antibody tests? What if you have an allergic reaction to the ingredients of the vaccine? What if your religion strongly opposes the vaccine? These are questions that also need to be explored. I don't think a person should necessarily abandon their rights and rush off and get the vaccine, but they need to have that open discussion with their employer and express the way that they feel and apply for an exemption. Like I said, every policy should have an exemption process. Ask HR about the exemption process. Ask what you can do not to take the vaccine. Look at different alternatives.
Thank you so much. This question, sorry, just bear with me. 1 second, sorry about that, Islam. Thank you, Craig, and thank you, Islam. There's a question from Zuraida. I'm going to read it verbatim. In terms of being dismissed for incapacitation, if one is in no way incapacitated nor pose as a risk to anyone, are those not grounds for discrimination? I feel that everyone is responsible for themselves and in no way is anyone a risk to anyone else. Over to you, Islam.
That's a good point you mentioned, Zureda, and that essentially is the core of the issue. And I agree with you that if a person is posing no risk and there is a very minimal chance of spreading the virus, like they're working from home or they've got a very little impact on creating an unsafe working environment, then to force that person to take the vaccine would be unfair to them. So I agree with the point that you mentioned that it all depends on the person's situation and their circumstances. There is no blanket rule. And that was my main fear when the CCMA award had hit and the newspapers had latched onto it, that people would just start getting extremely anxious and getting vaccinated, when in reality, each case should be decided on its own.
Thank you so much. There's a question from Zureda. I hope that answers your question. There's a question from Brenda, and it says follow-up question as well. I'm going to read it verbatim. The employer wants a safe working condition. What then is a safe working environment in the workplace? And what about other illnesses that was allowed by employers, such as HIV or TB, swine flu, and bird flu? Thank you.
That's a very good question, Brenda. I've got the judgment in front of me, or the award from the CCMA in the Koch versus Dhaka case. And if anyone's interested in the award, they're welcome to contact our office. We'll send them copies of both arbitration awards for them to read. Essentially, to answer your first question, what is a safe working environment? That's defined in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which lists what is a safe working environment. Now, the government has provided a consolidated directive on the 11th of June 2021, which states that an employer must come up with a plan of action in relation to a mandatory vaccination policy, and that the employer must be aware of employees' constitutional rights, in particular, their right to bodily integrity and their right to freedom of religion, belief, and opinion. This ties in onto that aspect of traditional. What if you ask the question? I think it was Eric which asked that it's my traditional beliefs. It doesn't only have to be with religion. So to answer your question, Brenda, where do we draw the line? You are correct. What is a safe working environment? An employer could demand mandatory vaccination today, and tomorrow could they demand that you also make sure that your ears are clean and that you don't have any athlete's foot or something like that. Where do we draw the line between mandatory vaccination for COVID and creating or micromanaging a safe working environment? That is the question. Where do we draw the line?
Thank you so much, Brenda, and thank you Brendan, rather, and thank you so much, Aslam. Aslam, there's a rather controversial but a good question from July Mnizi. July, and I'm going to read it verbatim. Is it fair for vaccinations to be made mandatory while pharmaceutical companies are immune from liability?
Well, July, I don't know if they're immune from liability. Every company can be sued for medical negligence or malpractice, etc. So they won't necessarily be immune from any liability. To answer your question, The companies are not immune from liability. If any company has done anything wrong, they can be sued and taken to task for negligence. And in terms of the mandatory vaccination, that is exactly the issue that we're dealing with right now. Where do we draw the line? How do we know if it's safe? What are the long-term impacts of this? Who do we hold liable? Do we sue the company that made the vaccination, or do we sue the employer that forced us to take the vaccination? Who do we sue?
Thank you so much, Aslam. There's a question from Okpugu. You will forgive me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. I'm going to read it verbatim. Since the ingredients in the vaccines are not disclosed and the long-term adverse effects have not been established, in companies where COVID-19 vaccinations has been made mandatory, can employees sue in the event of harm and/or injuries sustained as a result of COVID vaccination? I think you have answered that question, Aslam. Do you want to go further, but I think you have answered that question.
We have covered that, Ahmed.
Thank you. There's a last question from Zuraida. Sorry, there's two. There's a question from Zuraida. Is termination the same as dismissal?
Yes, Zuraida. Termination would be the same as dismissal. Termination is more a American word, and dismissal is the South African word. So in South Africa, we generally use the word dismissed from work, and in America, you would be terminated. A word hardcore word, terminated.
Thank you, Aslam. Aslam, there's a question from Adrian Smith from ABSA. I'm going to read verbatim. The employer has a duty of care in ensuring a safe working environment for all employees in terms of Section 8 of the OHSA. In the Malgin SCCMA case, the applicant refused to take further COVID tests, which, if allowed, would place the employer in an adverse position. What is your comment on that, sir?
If I understand the question correctly, but essentially, I think the argument is if I had continued, or if the applicant had continued to take the test, would it be necessary to then dismiss the applicant? Because the applicant then is actively saying, I don't have COVID every week, which is thereby creating a safe working environment. Is that the question?
Adrian, would you want to clarify that? Is that your question? You can simply unmute your mic and or your video.
Thanks. Yes. So actually, mine was more a statement or a comment saying that the applicant essentially refused to take further COVID tests. As I understand it in the CCMA case, that he had at one stage taken one or two, but then further refused to it. So I think it was just, my statement was just that if the employer had allowed the employee to continue working without taking the COVID tests, it obviously would have then placed the employer in the wrong in terms of the act.
Yes, that's an astute observation, Adrian. Have I pronounced your name correctly?
100%. Yes, 100%.
Okay. Wonderful, Adrian. That is a correct observation. And in fact, it could be a very good argument to make long term. If I was acting for the employee, I would say, your obligation is to create a safe working environment, Mr. Employer. I'm doing this at my own cost. Every week I come and I show you my negative PCR test, and thereby I am contributing to a safe working environment. But the question then is it sustainable? Can you get a test every week? What about the cost of that? Maybe bigger companies should provide in-house COVID testing on a regular basis. These are questions to consider. And we are living in unprecedented times. So maybe we have unprecedented legal principles as well.
Thank you, Aiden. I hope that answers your question. There's a comment by NLHA Consulting. It reads as follows, and I'm going to read it verbatim. It is maybe important to state that the findings of a CCMA commissioner does not create a precedent, but might have persuasive value. Employers can discipline and dismiss, but they still need to follow due process, such as having a policy, doing their risk analysis, and considering other alternative sanctions. Another test for presiding officers would be testing the contents of the implemented policy. Your comments on that, Islam?
Yes, that is a very good observation. There's two parts to it that I want to comment on. The first is the persuasive value of CCMA awards, and the second being that the policy needs to be properly followed. Let's talk a bit about the persuasive value. It is correctly pointed out that a CCMA award is persuasive value. And what that means is that in South Africa, we have a common law system. We have different ranking of courts. We have the Constitutional Court, which is right on the top, and below that we have various divisions of different courts. The CCMA is a creature of statute, what we call a body which is established in terms of the Labour Relations Act. Now, when a CCMA makes a ruling, it's not equal to a judgment from the Constitutional Court. They can never be equal. However, the fact that the CCMA has made a ruling then becomes a form of a guidance note to say in the future, this is probably how a CCMA might interpret the case. There's a lot of factors, probably and might. Ultimately, like I've indicated earlier, it does boil down to each individual case. Will turn on its own evidence and its own merits. A CCMA award can then be taken on review to the Labour Court. At the Labour Court, if a judgment is made by a Labour Court judge, that will have a higher ranking value than a CCMA award. So your observation is correct that the CCMA award is not a Constitutional Court award. However, it is the most recent decision that we have on this issue. And in the absence of any other legal principles, we have to go with these for now. But they can be subject to challenge. That's the first principle. The second that I'd like to comment on is the fact that companies must still follow due process. That goes without saying. It's absolutely true. A company cannot just hire and fire someone. There's got to be proper processes in place. In fact, the COC judgment at the CCMA cites various regulations from the consolidated directives which need to be followed. And I've indicated earlier, if anyone wants a copy of these judgments, please feel free to contact us. We can be reached at our company website, legalleaders.co.za, or you can just Google Moolla Attorneys and contact us from our office number. But essentially, the policies must be followed. Any company, before they dismiss someone, must follow the proper policies and procedures.
Thank you so much, Islam. Islam, there's a question from Brandon. I'm going to read it verbatim. Islam, what is your expert opinion if the employee has already had COVID-19 and they are forced to vaccinate due to the employee I'm assuming it meant having antibodies against COVID-19. The employee takes the vaccine and ends up falling ill, ends up in hospital, and passed due to the vaccination. Would the employer not be liable for this?
Well, that's a good question, Brandon, and I wonder if it's Brandon from LinkedIn that we normally communicate with. This is something that I think employers should consider. The fact that a person who has positively recovered from the illness, remember, what's the purpose of the vaccine? The purpose of the vaccine is to stimulate an immune response in an individual. If a person has recovered from COVID, their body, let me go into it a bit more detail, and please mind me, I'm no medical doctor, but I have invested quite a bit of time into this. How this works actually, Brandon, is, and I stand to be corrected. When a virus enters into a person's bloodstream or their body, generally the body would try and develop some kind of antibodies, some kind of resistance. Some viral strains, the body cannot provide the right antibodies to combat. As a result, the virus then spreads and the person can then suffer from a serious illness. However, when a person recovers from the illness, either through medication or hospitalization or whatever, their body will then remember the virus, and next time the virus enters the bloodstream, the body will be able to release a form of protection. In some people, antibodies are already present, and the antibody test can prove this. It's floating in their stream. These are little soldiers ready to attack the virus. In others, the body doesn't have ready antibodies for fighting, but the body has something called killer B cells. Killer B cells, B for banana. These are the cells that help produce antibodies. Now, the copy of the virus, that source code almost, is stored in the killer B cells. In other words, even if a person doesn't have the virus, they can still, or antibodies, they can still develop an immune system response through the killer B cells. It might just take a while for the body to produce the immune response. So the point being that if a person has naturally recovered from the illness, they've already achieved what vaccination seeks to achieve, which is an immunized response. Vaccines are meant to create an immunized response. And the fact that you have an immunized response naturally, why should you then also take the vaccine? It's a valid argument.
Thank you, Aslam. Thank you, Aslam, for that response, and thank you, Brandon, for that question. There's a question from Roland. I'm going to read from you. It's a comment, and thereafter a question follows. I'm going to read it verbatim. EUA products are unapproved, unlicensed, and experimental. Under the Nuremberg Code of Foundation of Ethical Medicine, no one may be coerced to participate in a medical experiment. The individual's consent is absolutely essential. No court has ever upheld a mandate for an EUA vaccine. Now I come to Roland's question. Does companies have the right to go ahead to mandate an experimental procedure, in this case, COVID-19 vaccines?
Yes, that is precisely the issue that we are dealing with. And that was one of the questions that we had to consider. But that is why I also wanted to cover the policies. For instance, the British government have come out openly and said, no, there must be mandatory vaccinations. The American government have come out and said, if you employ more than 100 people, we want to have mandatory vaccinations, or you come with your negative PCR test. Those are situations where the government has just passed legislation and passed regulations. We don't have that in South Africa. So unfortunately, we are left without guidance from the government in respect of that. And the only means to resolve the issue is from a court, unfortunately.
Thank you, Aslam, and thank you, Roland, for that question. I hope that answers your question, Roland. Now there's a question from from Portia. I'm going to read verbatim. Since it is the employer's duty to ensure a safe working environment, is it not, I assume, the employer's duty to provide in a manner of taking up the cost of COVID testing?
Yes, that's a good observation, Pasha. I think if the government had to say employers must take up the cost, that would impact a lot of small to medium enterprises. And right now, what we have is mainly corporates that are issuing mandatory vaccination policies. However, I think policies and rather regulations from government need to be more cognizant of small to medium enterprises. Can a small business that employs 10 people take up the cost of mandatory vaccinations and paying for PCR tests? That's the question. And coming out from COVID times, where businesses are trying to take off, the economy is taking off, do we then impose that cost? And coming on the other side, the flip side, Pasha, might be, is it fair then for the employee to burden that cost? Simply because the employee also has a bond, a car, a family to look after, paying tax. Who should bear the cost? Maybe it should be 50-50. I don't know.
Thank you so much for that, Aslam. Aslam, there's due to time limitations, I'm going to take two more questions. One is a question from Bart Ford, and the other one is a question from Lerato within the question box. And thereafter, regrettably, I'm going to close the question and answer session. Over to you, Advocate Bart Ford. You can simply unmute your mic and or your video.
Aslam, thank you so much. Thank you, AJ. So I'm a bit concerned, and I just want to share an observation. Whenever these discussions come up, there's always the question as to the liability that an employer may suffer as against an employee is required to subject himself to a mandatory vaccination in instances where the vaccine causes adverse effects. And this issue had been tested previously, and it was found that in terms of Section 35(1) of the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act, that an employer is protected against any claim instituted by an injured or sick employee. In fact, that section reads as follows: no action shall lie by an employee or any dependent of an employee for the recovery of damages in respect of any occupational injury or disease resulting in the disablement or death of such an employee. So the moment a COVID-related illness arises from vaccination, the notion that employees might have that they can institute a claim for damages against an employer has already been dealt with, and there's case law to the effect that you cannot sue or hold the employer liable for damages in that regard.
If I could touch on that, Council.
Yes.
That is a good observation, Council, and a good part one. The challenge that we have with that is that generally when one thinks of COIDA and occupational injuries, the prominent example is someone is climbing a ladder at work, they install aircons, they fall from the ladder, break their leg, and now they want to sue the company. They were performing in the course and scope of their duties, they have sustained an injury, and now they want to go and take millions from the company. As I would understand it, that is the gist of COIDA. What happens when an employer, with the risks of a long-term untested vaccine and without government interference, introduces a forced mandatory vaccination policy and forces the employee against his or her wishes to take the vaccine, and against their complaint saying, I don't want to take the vaccine, but I'm forced to do it because you are asking me to do it. And you'll tell me that I'm going to get fired if I don't take it. The employee takes the vaccine, sustains an adverse reaction for any number of reasons. We don't know. We're not medical experts, or might not sustain. But for purpose of this example, takes the vaccine, sustains an adverse reaction, and passes on. can an argument not be made that this was actually a form of severe negligence on behalf of the company? I don't know. I'm not pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, and neither am I for forced or unforced. But these are things to consider, that bearing in mind, this is a forced vaccination policy. The employee has indicated their objection to taking it, voiced their objection, and the employer has unilaterally going ahead. Can we compare that scenario to someone falling down a ladder and breaking their leg, and the employer then being insured for that? I don't know. It might well be as a technical defense. If counsel for the company says, sorry, you can't sue me, or judge might see it otherwise.
Thank you, Aslam. I suppose we will debate this matters in time to come. At length.
Hopefully not against each other, though, Advocate Bart.
Thank you so much, Aslam, and thank you, Bart, for that question. There's a last question from Aslam, with your indulgence. There's a question from Andrew Goldberg. I know I said that there's a last question from the chat, and there's a question. Would you mind taking that?
Sure.
Thank you. Now before I get to that question, I'm gonna go to the question from Lirato in the chat, and I'm gonna read that verbatim. There was an indication made that if a refusal is made based on religious grounds, a letter from the religious organization would be required. In the case of a refusal based on traditional grounds, what would then be required? Would a registered traditional healer letter suffice?
Yes, generally it would depend, Lerato, on the policy that you are reading at the moment. In other words, generally the policy would say, and from what I've seen, if it's medical grounds, then you need evidence from a medical practitioner. If it's religious grounds, then from a religious expert like a priest or someone that can come and complete an affidavit for you. But a registered traditional healer would then be the best person in that scenario to form as evidence or to substantiate the basis for why you do not want to take the vaccine. I always encourage clients to always provide evidence to substantiate why they don't want to do it. In other words, it's not good enough to say, I don't want to take, for instance, the case with Teresa Malderich versus the Gold Rush Group. She was not represented. And she indicated two reasons. Number one, her right to bodily integrity. And number two, she said her fears. And quite frankly, was that enough to put forward a strong enough defense to say, I should not be vaccinated? Where was the proof? What about, did she explore medical reasons? Did she try getting an affidavit from a pastor or priest or traditional healer, registered traditional healer? Either way, if you are going to make a claim, make sure that you are substantiating the claim with proper evidence.
Thank you so much for that, Aslam. Now there's a last question, and the last question is from Andrew Goldberg. Andrew Goldberg, you can simply unmute your mic and or your video. Andrew Goldberg.
Sorry, no, I just want to say thank you for the show. I thought this, hi, good day. Thank you
Hey,
for
Andrew.
I just wanted to say thank you for the show. I didn't want to actually ask a question. I just wanted to point out if there are damages claims, the answer to that question is that the damages claims are to be referred to the Workmen's Compensation in terms of the Workmen's Compensation Act. The employer is just following his plan, so he cannot be held responsible in terms of the Occupational Health Safety Act unless he does something wrong. Like, let's say he brings in a plan that it doesn't fulfill what it should fulfill. But other than that, he cannot be held responsible for anything that happens at his employment. What is duty on the employee and the employer is to launch a case at the Workmen's Compensation. You got 120 days to do that. And then if you fail to do it in 120 days, you can ask for extension. But after 3 months, that is gone. So it's 120 days and then 3 months after that. Once the 120 days and the 3-month period is gone, then the case is as good as dead.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Aslam. Aslam, before I move on to the conclusion, I have there's a comment which I deem to be very necessary to make, and that's from Mr. Das. And he says, grateful to Aslam and the South African Bar Association. I am listening from Dhaka, Bangladesh. And that's just to show how far-reaching this platform is. So thank you for that. Of more importance, Aslam, and it gives me great pride and pleasure in welcoming, or rather to have your conclusion done by Advocate Ronelle Ferguson. Advocate Ronelle Ferguson, she's from the South African Bar Association and holds a lot of respect with the South African Bar Association. Over to you, Advocate Ronelle Ferguson.
Thank you, Advocate.
Thank you, AJ. I've been given the privilege of thanking you, Aslam, for a tremendously thought-provoking discussion. There are many attendees here that joined purely because of the nature of the topic, not necessarily being as well versed in this particular field. I found the questions a perfect illustration of the interest in the topic and the animus to learn more about this particular side of legislation. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. And to our other delegates that are attending, you were reminded that the session was recorded. You can find that, and especially in the employee-employer environment, if one would want to share that with your partners and associates. It's available on the South African Bar Association website, www.rsabar.net. And we're going to have to take a look at this discussion again and the weighing up of the rights of individuals versus the rights of the public at large. I might just mention on a lighter note, one of the first memes that I saw on the topic was where Prince William was getting his vaccination and the voice bubble said, "I've done my research." And one of the aides standing behind him said, "You are the research." And I heard quite a little bit of that going on. But again, thank you very, very much. Thank you so much.
I'm honored. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Thanks, AJ.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Aslam, and thank you so much, Advocate Ronelle Ferguson.